Hello and welcome to the Quickstarter dedicated to the English opening. Our approach to 1c4 in the course will be to play the English, but sort of on our terms. There's plenty of move orders here which flow into each other, and by starting with g7, g6 here, which is once again my recommendation, just as it was in the Chess24 course all those years back, we can't avoid playing, let's say, the symmetrical c4, c5 English altogether, but we can make sure that we don't have to study some absolute mainline theory which can arise from playing c4, c5. Of course, g6 also allows white some additional options, but I feel like those options aren't critical enough for us to be worried about them. To begin with, d4 knight f6 transposes into our beloved Grunfeld, so that clearly is not an issue for us at all. g3, we play c5. The inclusion of g6 and g3 with the move c4 and c5 on the board already limits white's options a great deal, and after bishop g2, bishop g7, the most likely outcome by far is that play will transpose into the lines that are covered by different move orders after knight c3, knight c6, and now most likely knight f3, although obviously a lot of other moves exist. Knight f3 is by far the main option white utilizes in this position. The reason we're playing c5 here instead of bishop g7 is that if you play bishop g7 and white goes d2, d4, we might actually struggle to transpose into our symmetrical Grunfelds, because white probably will be in time to meet the move c7, c6 with the move e2, e4, and this is not very desirable. So in this position, white has a number of very solid choices. The one that comes closest to refuting the black setup, or at least the one that should come closest in an ideal world from the white player's viewpoint, is the move e2, e4, trying to make us play the Queen's Indian, the King's Indian, of course, not the Queen's Indian. Apologies. But we're not going to be playing the King's Indian here. That's a choice that people should be making on their own, and I'm never going to be recommending it. We should play e5 here, fighting for the center straight away. And knight f3, bishop g7 leads to sort of the King's Indian-ish positions, but black will never really be forced to play d7, d6, as I will show you in a moment, and that gives us a lot of freedom of choice. The way for white to really try to punish the setup is the move d2, d4, but I think the current state of theory there suggests that black is completely fine. So let's look at knight f3 first. We play bishop g7, d4 is the only real logical continuation here. You can definitely play knight c3 here, but after knight c6, white will no longer have the option of pushing d4 at all, at least for the time being. And if you want to play the e4, c4 types of the English opening, you should probably be developing knight to e2 and not f3 anyway, because on f3 kind of it is counterintuitive to at least some of the plans that white might want to go for later. It's much more harmoniously placed on e2. So having played knight f3, white really should be playing d4. We will take, knight takes. I will note that it is possible and entirely playable here to go knight c6, knight takes c6, and b takes c6. But I think the move knight f6 that I will be going to that I'm going to recommend is a cleaner solution, because we just go for very direct, very quick counterplay in the center, and the positions that arise here are just very often quite fun to play. Knight c3, of course, is the main move here. If white goes e5, after knight e4, already black is doing quite well, because the pawn on e5 is a target, and black can actually develop very strong play against it very quickly in positions like this. If white goes bishop d3, trying to get the king out of the center as fast as possible, this gives us additional freedom, let's say after castles, castles. We normally want to play c6 here and then d7, d5, but the way white positioned their pieces allows us to even start with d7, d5 without preparing it and wasting a tempo on c7, c6, which I quite like because it makes the game even more forcing and even faster, so to speak. C takes d5, c6. This is, of course, the point. With the bishop on d3 getting in the way of the queen on d1 protecting the white knight, we can just win the pawn back by reversing the order of c6 and d5 here. And if white goes h3 here, which is a logical move, trying to take away the g4 square and reply to c takes d5 with e5. But of course this comes at a price of not having played knight c3 yet, meaning that we can play knight e4 quite safely, f4. And in this position I quite like the idea of playing f7, f6 straight away. And after something like bishop e3, fe5, fe5, rook f1, queen f1. We should play knight c6 here. You should note that being too greedy and allowing white the amount of activity that they get in a line like this is completely unnecessary. But if we play, after queen f1, if we play knight c6 immediately, these types of lines will no longer really be available to white, and we get to finish our development, and play remains very, very unclear here. Leaving us with the move knight c3. And once again, we're just not planning to play d7, d6. The idea in every single line here is to castle and then go for the immediate break in the center with some combination of the moves c6, d5, and rook e8. And interestingly, of all the natural moves that white has in this position, the only one that really does anything is the move bishop c1, e3. And even more interestingly, in this position, I think most people would just automatically play rook e8. But this is a mistake, because after bishop d3, c6, castles, d5, cd5, cd5, the rook on e8 provides a very nice target for a very clever move, bishop d3, b5. And suddenly equality is not at all assured for us, because we have to spend a tempo going rook e8. And white definitely develops some initiative. It's possible to try to analyze this position to a draw, but there is a better choice, so we don't have to. After bishop e3, we go c6. And here we see another point of the bishop on e3. A piece has been interposed between the rook on e8 and the king on e1, meaning that white can play e4, e5 without fearing the move rook e8. This is the most principal solution, and also the only one that really promises white anything at all. If white goes bishop d3 instead, we can just play d7, d5. And this is, after, let's say, c takes d5, c takes d5, as you can see, it's a very similar position that we've just discussed, but the rook is on f8 and the king is on e1, meaning that there is no tempo with bishop b5, and black is just enjoying a much, much better version of the position that was brought up earlier, and has no problems whatsoever. If white goes knight b3, now we can go rook e8, and protecting the pawn on e4 comfortably is not going to be that easy, because we can reply with d7, d5 to almost any move that white can choose to play here. And as is very often the case in these positions, c4, c5 looks interesting until you start looking at positions like rook e8, f3, and b6 closer, because it's impossible for white to actually maintain the pawn on c5 and not trade it. And once it gets traded away, d7, d5 actually gains in strength as a central break. And very often in positions like these, white actually starts experiencing some issues with perhaps even achieving equality. But e4, e5 is a very serious move. Knight e8. And briefly here, when preparing the course, I was briefly very worried about the health of the entire line, because the move h2, h4, which I completely missed when I was preparing this for the chess 24 course all those years ago. In those times, the computers were a lot less free with their pawns, and h4 just never came up, and it didn't occur to me either. Here, this is quite a serious problem, because both bishop takes e5, h5, and d6, e6, very importantly, fe6, h5, were not entirely to my satisfaction, because there is a lot of initiative white gains by opening up the h-file so quickly. But I think I found a very good solution. We start by playing queen e7. The intention here is to meet h5 with d6. Once again, we're not doing this to take on e5. We're doing this to play e6 in a way that would allow us to meet e6 with bishop takes e6 and then queen takes e6, which maintains our structure on the king side in a much more functional state, and doesn't really soften our pawns there to the extent that, let's say, they get softened up in this line. After h5 d6, white probably takes on g6. There's really no reason for us to give them the entire h-file. So we take with the f-pawn. And now the most critical move is c4, c5, trying to include as many pieces in the attack as possible. Queen b3 check, bishop c4 check, all of these ideas become possible. And d5 does allow white to play f4, which we generally wouldn't really like, because we would like to at least either take or trade away the pawn on e5. So the time has come for us to pick it up. C takes d6, knight takes d6, queen b3 check. I quite like the setup with knight f7 here, white castles queenside, and we further drop some pieces back to prevent bishop h6, to sidestep potential f2, f4 ideas. We are a pawn up here, but white of course has plenty of compensation. White is well developed. They actually got to quite harmoniously evacuate the king out of the center and to c1, but we've definitely parried the immediate attack, and finally can start developing our own play. a5 with the idea of either a4 or queen b4 is a useful idea here. Knight d7, knight c5 or knight d7, knight d5 is also something that we would like to play, and particularly if we can find a way to take the sting out of the knight d4 e6 idea. And bishop g4 is definitely a move that might be quite annoying here for white to face if they don't prepare for it, because the rook might not have particularly comfortable squares to go to. All in all, just a very unclear position, which I struggle to evaluate properly, so I will trust the numbers on my screen, which were telling me that this is very playable for black, and we should not be afraid here. So with this, we come back to the move d2, d4, which is very critical, but black is fine. We will play knight f6 here. Important to note that the naive e takes d4 is borderline losing, in particular after knight f6, because after bishop g5, we cannot play bishop g7, forcing us to put the bishop on e7, and now after knight c3, this is just a very rotten position. You should not be playing it, which is why we go knight f6. Here the main move is knight f3, but I will note that one of the points of playing knight f6 is that if white goes knight c3, we can go e takes d4, queen takes d4, and now our rook is not hanging, of course, allowing us to play knight c6 and then develop the bishop to g7, getting the type of a King's Indian position that is entirely playable, as opposed to the horrible position in which we were forced to play bishop e7. D takes e5 on move 4 is a move you could make if you wanted to, but after knight takes e4 we generally are completely fine. For instance, after queen d5 we can play f7, f5, which is often the way we will be dealing with the threats to the knight on e4. And after ef we just get to develop pieces very naturally. Takes, queen d1, we can go d5, knight f3, knight c6, with the ideas of like bishop b4 check and castles short. And we're actually somewhat better developed here. Material equality has not been breached, and we have decent ways of ensuring king safety, so I don't foresee any problems. After knight f3, the time has come for us to take on d4. White goes e4, e5. And here I am changing my recommendation from the Chess24 course. I used to give knight e4 here, which I think still survives, but there are some lines there which require very precise play to try to resolve the problems white can pose. Instead, a much more solid move has emerged, which is bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and queen e7, which very often leads to endgames which are very Berlin-like in their general outlook. But we will not be behind in development, and I think we're doing completely fine there. The main move here is bishop takes b4. Notably, if white goes queen e2 instead, trying to re-establish the threat of e takes f6, we can reply with d3, queen takes d3, and now that the pin is back in full force, we can go knight c6, and the pawn on e5 is potentially in a bit of trouble. So bishop b4, queen d2. We have to take and play knight h5, but we have enough counterplay against the e5 pawn here to force, I think, very, very playable endgames. Knight takes d4. I like the move knight c6 here more than the idea of playing b6, bishop b2, bishop b7, which is something Veselin Topalov did against Ding Liren in 2020. But I don't think this is unplayable. I just think it's unnecessary. Is my conclusion here. After knight c6, white has a number of options, but for instance, after knight 2f3, b6, knight c6, dc6, we get, I think, a very, very decent of the version of the Berlin, as was seen in the game between, once again, Ding Liren on the white side against Sam Shankland. g3, c5, bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, king e7, and we're about to start aiming our knight at the d4 square. I don't really see why we should be even remotely worse here. It seems like this is just a very, very playable Berlin. If white goes returning to the position after c4 and g6, if white goes knight f3, we play bishop g7 here. Once again, of course, d4, knight f6 is pure Grunfeld, leaving us with the option of playing knight c3. And here, very importantly, we play c7, c5. And the point of this move order, this position actually is one of the best illustration of why we're starting with g6 first. If we want to fianchetto this bishop, the moves c5, g6, and bishop g7 are the three moves we will need in every single situation. Whereas choosing between knight c6 and knight f6 can be done and should be done once white commits to a plan here. And this can be seen in particular here when we start looking at moves e3 and d4. I will note that g3 knight c6 transposes back into the symmetrical c4, c5, g3, g6 English, which we will talk about a bit later. So if white goes e3 here, we play knight f6, d4, cd4, knight d4, castles, bishop e2, d5 is already extremely comfortable for black, so white will recapture with the pawn and we will play d5. And here I want to show you a position which arises via a different move order. In the sort of classical c4, c5 English, c4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, g6, white goes e3. And in order to play d5, once white plays d4, you have to play knight f6 here, takes, takes, and d5. So we have this position with the two knights out and the bishop still on f8. And we have the position in our file with the bishop on g7 and the knight still on b8. And the difference is here, for instance, white can go c takes d5, knight takes d5, queen b3. And if we take on c3 in this position, bishop c4 is a very, very serious move. In fact, by far the main move in the position, creating a very annoying threat of bishop takes f7 and pretty much forcing black to either play e6 immediately or play knight d5 and then e6. Whereas in the line I was just showing you, none of this will be possible for white at all, because whenever the f7 pawn is threatened, we can just castle. Meaning that our position is instantly a lot safer. And as an illustration, after cd5, knight d5, bishop c4, knight c3, queen b3 is just completely unplayable here, because even knight e4 exists, since bishop takes f7, king f8 is no longer any kind of a mating attack, it's just one check. So white goes bishop b takes c3. And here it's actually important not to castle immediately and to start by playing queen c7, using the fact that with the kings on e8 and e1, queen takes c3 is a check, making the potential sacrifice of the pawn on c3 a lot less attractive. For instance, after bishop b3, queen c3, bishop d2, and queen d3, we are preventing white from castling kingside, and we are already very happy with the outcome of the opening. And if white plays queen b3 after queen c7, we will just castle. And now after both castles, knight c6 with ideas of knight a5, b6, bishop b7, and so on, and let's say knight g5, e6 castles, knight c6, with all of the same ideas, we just get a very, very playable setup with the hanging pawns and our king side quite safe. We have already castled. White's initiative is not really amounting to very much. These positions are definitely playable for both sides, but there is absolutely no reason for us to dislike them. They're very double-edged. And the other reason for specifically making the 3 moves we've made without committing to a knight move is the move d4. Here we will take, and we immediately attack the knight on d4 here, which means that white cannot get a proper Marazzi structure by playing e2, e4, because we just don't give them time for that. e3, knight f6 is instantly very comfortable, because with the bishop stuck back on c1, we will just castle and play d7, d5 with a very, very comfortable play. Meaning that white pretty much has to play knight c2 here if they want to at least threaten us with a Marazzi. And here, knight f6, e4 is actually a pretty decent Marazzi already, because we did force knight c2. But there is an even more concrete way of playing. We can take on c3, ruining the white king side, and then go knight f6. Here our plan is to play queen a5, and then perhaps d6, bishop e6. The rook comes out to c8. We're just going to be playing against the white pawns on c3 and c4, which does generate a lot of counterplay. White should immediately establish the pawns on f3 and e4 here to at least have the plan of going, let's say, knight e3, knight e5 later in the game. As a kind of general piece of advice here, we don't particularly value taking on the pawn on c3 unless it comes with additional benefits, because the bishop on c1 is currently not really doing very much, and opening up the entire long diagonal for it has to have some justification. The pawn we really would like to win is the pawn on c4, not the pawn on c3. So we currently just play d7, d6. White goes bishop e2. We castle. White castles, bishop e6. So we're just merrily coming along and trying to put pressure on the white queen side. Knight e3 is probably the main move here. If white goes rook b1, we are of course not obliged to trap our own queen by playing queen a2, knight a3. That would be a mistake. After rook b1, we have plenty of options. We can go rook a b8, or even perhaps a sharper move like rook f c8, preparing to start playing quite aggressively against the white setup if they take on b7. And if white goes knight e3, here I actually am suggesting to take on c3, specifically because after rook b1 we have a very clever move queen d4, leaving white with a weird choice of either allowing the queen trade, after which we get very decent positions, or playing something like queen e1 to avoid the queen trade. But then they will have to spend more time unpinning the knight on e3 before they can even proceed with any of their plans. And this finally brings us to the symmetrical c4, c5 English I've been referring to all this time. The main move order to achieve that for both sides, I guess, is knight c3. We of course play c5 here, just as in most other situations. We need to make this move as early as possible, specifically to avoid the potential transpositions into the King's Indian, and also to have the knight f3, bishop g7, d4, cd4, knight takes d4, and knight c6 line available to us yet again. White plays g3 here, bishop g7, bishop g2, knight c6. This is sort of the starting position of the symmetrical c4, c5 English. White can make a number of moves here. Pretty much every single move you can think of is sort of legal here. e3 is a very old theoretical idea here. e4 is actually something we will discuss in a moment. These days people started playing b3, a3. d3 is something I played with white and also recently played with black. But the main move, of course, is knight f3. We'll get to that at the end, but at first let's look at some of the other options. If white goes e4 here, which is a kind of an old school setup trying to go knight g2, then perhaps d3, bishop e3, and push for d3, d4 later in the game. This particular move order, I think, gives us even more freedom than usual, because with the knight back on g8, we can immediately start pushing for counterplay on the queen side by playing a7, a6. which in my opinion, pretty much forces white to play a4, because something like knight g2, b5, cb5, ab5, knight b5, and bishop a6 is, I think describing this position as double-edged doesn't do justice to how well we're doing here. And this is like a very, very pleasant benko. And after a4, we play d6, d3, knight f6. I think a logical move here is to play h3, because if white goes knight g2, we will very, very happily play bishop g4. We will actually take on e2 even unprovoked here if allowed, and if white has to play f2, f3, we will quite happily drop back to d7, and provoking f3 in these types of positions is very valuable to us. And if h3, there's a very typical maneuver here I think it is valuable to be aware of. We can go knight d7, knight g2, and knight f8, using the fact that we haven't castled yet. And after bishop e3, knight e6, we have landed the knight on e6 quickly enough to completely stop any kind of d3, d4 dreams white could have. And then we can just finish development knowing that our complete control of the d4 square gives us a very, very pleasant game. If white plays a3 on move 5, the idea of pushing b4, of course, makes perfect sense, but we can immediately prepare for it by playing b6, b4, and bishop b7, neutralizing the white bishop on g2, rook b1. Here I like d6 better than I like the move rook b8, specifically because it gives us the option of course, recapturing with the d-pawn, which can be seen in the line bc, bishop takes e3, and then d takes e5. And already I think we are very happy and will be playing for an advantage, because this is a very, very unimpressive queenside. Which is why white probably plays bishop b2 here. In this position, I like continuing to control the d4 square for some time yet by not putting knight on f6 at all, playing e6, knight f3, knight g7. White's plans in positions like this generally revolve around the idea of trading the bishop on b2 for the bishop on g7. But it's too early to do this, because after, let's say, knight b5, we can take on b2 and play knight e5, which is a very strong move using the fact that the bishop on g2 is also unprotected. So white should castle first. And now castles knight b5 would be somewhat imprecise. We're slightly worse here. But we can and should take on b4 twice. And white doesn't really have anything particularly stronger than winning the pawn back with bishop a3 and bishop b4. But in this position we have plenty of counterplay, in particular against the c4 pawn, and both d6, d5 trading it away, and also trying to attack it by going, let's say, knight 6, knight a5, or bishop a6. Are very valid plans here, and I don't really foresee any problems for us here at all. And this leaves us with one more small move I wanted to show you, apart from by far the main move, which is knight f3 on move 5. And this is the move d3, which was recently played against me by Haik Martirosyan in the Grand Suisse in Riga. I replied by playing knight f6. I think this is a clever way to start, because if you play e7, e6, it actually quite significantly improves white's situation if they want to play e4. Because as you will have seen earlier, even in this video, we generally don't want to be playing e7, e6 in those positions at all. So white basically won a full tempo in comparison. So we go knight f6, Haik played e3, I played e6, knight g2, castles, castles. And here I chose not to play d7, d5 straight away and play b6 first, because I wanted to have more pieces controlling the d5 square before I did that. Haik very logically pushed for a3 and b4. And here I actually very much like my reaction. If I play passively here after something like rook b1, you can definitely make an argument that it will be more problematic to equalize. But there is a very energetic move here, d7, d5. Using the fact that there's no bishop on d2 right now, and c takes d5, knight takes d5 is just borderline unplayable. And after b takes c5, we're not playing b takes c5, rook b1, that would be a mistake. We take on c4 here, and after d takes c4, we once again are not interested in re-establishing the symmetry. I played queen e7, and here the plan is, by protecting the bishop on b7, we want to play knight e5 pretty much as soon as possible, even after c takes b6. Honestly, during the game, I think I spent about 10 seconds on recapturing on b6 here. The engine suggests that even here knight e5 is a very strong move, giving black at least an equal game. But in more general terms, if those pawns get traded, we have so much counterplay against the pawn on c4 and a3, coupled with the idea of trading away the bishop on g2, after which white will also have to constantly pay attention to the light squares on the king side, that I believe that if anyone has to be careful here, it's not black, it's white. And this finally leaves us with the main line of the entire symmetrical English, which is knight f3. And once again, I will be recommending here the move that not very many people make these days, but a move which I believe is perfectly sound, e7, e6. If you want second opinions here, I quite like the idea of playing castles and bishop f5, and also castles and then e7, e6 is a line which I think not played very often, but I think it deserves a much better reputation than it currently has. But e6 is just simpler. We obviously want to play knight g7 and then d7, d5, achieving very, very nice central control. And the way to punish it is to play d2, d4, or at least attempt to punish it. If instead of d4 white goes h4, once again, it's a very solid move in pretty much every single position. Now, instinctively replying to it by knight f6, stopping h5 would be a mistake, because d4, cd4, and knight d4 actually gives white a very nice position. The entire philosophy of the line we're playing here rests on not giving white a comfortable way of playing d2, d4, so knight f6 would go against that. And the same applies to lines like d5, h5, knight g7, and d3, which was a bit better for white in the game between Mickey Adams and Wei Yi and Vike in 2016. But we can always meet h4 with h6, preparing to meet h5 is g5, of course. And now if white switches back to playing the d4 lines, we reply to it just as we would in the main line with the pawns on h2 and h7. And I think this inclusion is in general in black's favor, because the fact that we get a very, very nice g4 square for our pieces outweighs the fact that the pawn on h6 sometimes is hanging. Castles, knight f6, bishop f4, castles. We're still following the game between Van Hao and Giri from the candidates tournament in Yekaterinburg. And now Hao chose not to take an immediate draw with knight c7, knight b5, understandably, because he's a very ambitious player. But after queen c1, Anish missed a very nice trick here. The pawn h6 is hanging, but you can actually quite happily ignore it by playing bishop g4. And if bishop takes h6, you can play queen b6, push the knight back, and then the rook comes out to e8. The second one probably goes to c8. Knight e4 becomes a very serious topic. And there's never going to be any attack on the king side here for white, meaning that we don't really have to worry about the king safety. And we have basically like a large advantage in terms of representation in the center. The engines just flat out dislike this for white. So this would have been much, much stronger than the move a7, a6 that Anish chose in the game. And this brings us back to the original position and the move d2, d4. We take, knight b5, d5, cd5. Every time I choose to prepare this line for the videos, I spend some time checking queen a5 check, and every time the conclusion is the same. I think this works. I think black should equalize, but the way the lines shape up on my screen suggests to me that we will probably not enjoy learning how to equalize there. Because if white actually knows what they're doing there, and to pose problems there, white does need to show quite a lot of imagination. But if white does know what they're doing there, the path to equality becomes very, very machine-like, and one wrong move there will have potentially very disastrous consequences. So I like it takes d5 much more. If white castles here, we will play knight f6. And in more general terms, I think whenever possible, the knight has to be developed to f6 and not e7. Because what we have here is basically a Tarrasch, a kind of a classical Tarrasch structure. Once the pawn on d4 gets taken, and it will be taken. And in all of the Tarrasch positions, having the option of playing knight e4 later is very important. So there will be some positions in which knight g7 is also fine, but I think we should be aiming for knight f6 pretty much everywhere. Knight b takes d4, castles, bishop e3, or alternatively takes and bishop e3, rook e8 leads to the same position. And here after, let's say, bishop d4, bishop a6, rook e1, knight e4, we're aiming to play c6, c5, ironing out our hanging pawn structures. And after rook c1, rook c8, we'll be able to push c6, c5, for instance, after bishop g7, queen d4 check, queen f6, king f6, e3, and c5, which leads to an endgame which I feel we should not really be even in particular trouble in, because knight on e4 is quite active, the bishop on a6 is also a very nice piece. This rook goes to d8, this one potentially goes to b8, generating counterplay against the b2 pawn. And all in all, this is the type of a hanging pawn position which we should be quite satisfied with. If white takes on d4 with f3 knight, we go knight f6 yet again, castles, bishop e3. This is all very logical. White wants to play rook c1 and establish control over the center. Also, clearly white would very much like to force us to take on d4 instead of taking on c6, because leaving us with just a flat-out isolani on d5 is the absolute dream scenario. But there's really no way for white to force it, and in particular in this position we should be playing knight g4, challenging the setup which has the d4 square firmly under control, bishop f4, and here there's a very concrete solution. We can play a6, which is I think much stronger than knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen b6, knight b3, bishop b2, rook b1, bishop g7, and queen takes d5, which is a game between two very strong players. This happened in a game between Boris Gelfand and Petr Leko in the Tashkent Grand Prix in 2012. Black is not defenseless here, but white is definitely a bit better. Instead of all that, it's much better to play a6, knight c6, bc6, knight d4, and here, using the fact that the white pieces are slightly standing on air, we can actually push them back very efficiently by playing g6, g5. Knight c6, queen f6 doesn't work out for us because too many things are hanging. And because of that, the bishop actually has to go all the way back to c1. We play queen f6, e3, let's say rook e8, with a very, very unclear position in which a5, bishop a6 is the way to activate the bishop on c8. The knight often will drop back to e5, perhaps also indicating some bishop g4 possibilities. Eventually, we would like to play c6, c5. Queen h6 is also something that white needs to keep an eye on. Yes, we did have to compromise our kingside structure a little bit here to achieve this, but I think our piece activity here more than fully compensates for that one drawback that this position has. This concludes the Quickstarter on the English. There will be a lot of very sharp positions after c4, g6, together with, of course, some pretty solid, pretty symmetrical positions that you get in particular in the symmetrical c4, c5 English. But all in all, I think black is extremely healthy here. We don't have to run too many risks if we don't want to. And I think in most cases we equalize quite comfortably. But obviously there is a lot more material on all the lines I've shown you in the Quickstarter, in the course proper. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have fun studying these lines in the course. Thank you for watching.